My name is Mike Rasweiler, and I'm joining you from NOFA, New Jersey, a partner NOFA. You guys are attending the You've Got to Be Kidding Goats from Breeding to Kids with Grace Toy of Hops N Lops Farm. And I'm just going to take a couple seconds to just give you a little bit. You guys will probably see this in some of the other presentations, but basically we are presenting this conference on land that was inhabited by the Nipmuc people prior to European colonization. As we work to heal the destruction caused by colonization, we appreciate your support, solidarity, and continued learning. We recognize that our agricultural system is built on stolen land, and the forced labor and exploitation of stolen Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Our conference aims to help to address this harm and bring equity to the food system. We hope you'll participate in our BIPOC and White Ally caucus groups this weekend. We want to thank our sponsors. We encourage you to support them when you can. And I don't know if you've heard about it, but there's apparently a great auction happening, so you should check that out. Well, I'll put some links in the chat as the presentation goes forward, but I'm sure you'll find lots of ways to, I'm sure there'll be other places where you can find this links to this the auction. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Grace Toy, owner of Hops N Lops Farm. Grace Toy is the owner and is raising nationally recognized Nubian, Saanen, and LaMancha dairy goats in Harwinton, Connecticut. Farming experience started in 2006 with rabbits. In 2009, she added Dairy Goat Project. In 2015, Grace became an ADGA licensed judge and is currently an ADGA linear appraisal trainee. With 15 years in goat experience, she brings plenty of knowledge and experience, and I'm pleased to present her to you today. So Grace, whatever I can do to help get you going. If you want to.
Let's see if Zoom wants to work with me. Okay.
You should be able to share.
So is that working from your end?
It's looking good on my end.
Okay, perfect.
Can you guys see it on your screen in there? Great. All right.
Throw this in. I can make it really easy. So like he said, my name's Grace. For everyone that's here and everyone on Zoom. Ooh, it's gonna make my life easy. Okay, so since we have such a big group here, so originally my topic is technically kidding. So just, about breeding season, goals, kind of tips, tricks, what you need. But when I got the feedback from everyone online, it pretty much was a lot of people getting into goats or wanting to. So what is your situation since you're here?
We're looking at different options and stuff. We've had friends who've raised goats, but we haven't raised them specifically ourselves yet. Just trying to learn as much information as possible.
Okay, so you're looking at like milk, meat, brush control, everything.
A lot of brush, definitely brush control, because where we're at, there's a lot of undergrowth.
Okay.
Probably meat. I mean, honestly, like we haven't bought property yet. We've got a space where we can raise stuff ourselves, but multi-purpose.
Yeah. Hello.
Just on my chair.
Yeah, we finally made it here with everything set up. So, okay, I think we should be okay.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you. So yeah, when I saw that, I tried to add in a few slides that were kind of goat 101. There's time if we put my phone over so make sure I see that. But we have time to kind of go over that. So if there's more you're interested in, we can stop and talk about it or Zoom. I'm hopefully kind of keep an eye on that as well. And then there's stuff about kidding at the end, and there'll be time for questions that you might not think about. So this is kind of just a brief overview of what we'll talk about. See if it wants to work with me. There we go. Okay, so I just have these because I use this presentation. So primarily I raise dairy goats. I do a lot with conformation. We sell for the genetics all over the country. I judge and appraise. So a lot of it comes from structure, which I think when we talk about kidding is very important. But it's just 15 years of a 4-H project that I say has gone out of control. So I freshen about 30 does a year. I run a herd of 50 to 60, which is more than I want, but definitely plenty of experience through that. So terminology, just because sometimes I forget that not everybody uses the same terms and understands it. So if there's anything I say you don't get, feel free to yell at me and just stop me for a second. So buck is an intact male goat, not a billy. Slight pet peeve, but we're going to call them bucks and does today. A wether is a neutered male goat, which we might talk about when you're talking about meat and brush control. Heat is when the doe is able to be bred. Gestation is just referring to during pregnancy. And kidding is when they're actually giving birth. So, and these are just kind of my quick reminders to anyone who's new, is they are herd animals, so you need more than one. Especially if you're not going to be breeding them, get brush control. You might want to start with 3 just to make sure you kind of have a nice group. If you have, some people want to use them as horse companions and everything, make sure if you're doing that, you're getting animals that are used to horses. You don't want to just get a goat kid from like my farm where we only have goats and they see goats and dogs and that's about it. So just make sure that you're kind of finding a breeder or finding a farm that's going to fit your situation. So they require a browsing or roughage diet. So just like you want to use them for brush control, that's perfect. They need hay in their diet as well. They do also need grain, which we'll get into a little bit as well. We can kind of touch more on that. But typically those are your big things. Minerals, fresh water. They're easy keepers when they're managed correctly, is how I put it. So they don't eat tin cans. Like I said, make sure you check for poisonous plants. Mountain laurel, milkweed are 2 of the bigger ones in the area. But if you like Google, there'll be several lists online that you can kind of do some plant identification. They do love poison ivy. That's okay for them. Things like that. You just have to watch that they'll get like the oils on their skin if you're allergic. So my one little thing. Hooves. So they typically, the biggest thing is every 4 to 6 weeks, you're going to have to trim feed on them. There are people that do this. I think it's really easy enough, unless sometimes you have a physical problem, back problem. It's easy to do it on your own. Have somebody teach you, have your vet teach you, and then kind of just get them used to being handled. A lot of my goats, you can get a stand to put them on, which will be a picture of a stand. I just tie them to the fence and trim their feet, except for the milkers. It makes my life easier. And vet care. So typically you can do a lot of stuff on your own with goats, especially if they're pets, more browse control. Again, I will say I'm not an organic farmer, but I think anything livestock, the more you know, the better, and you can make your own educated decisions. So I do kind of talk about some different things in here that you may or may not want to consider for your own farm. But vet care, it's good. You need to visit your vet or have them come out like once a year to have that good relationship. For them to, if you have an emergency, you can call in depending on your clinic. So usually to have them out once a year, if you have an emergency, if you just want to do like a wellness check, you need health papers, that's a good time to kind of keep that relationship open. And then annual vaccine, CDT, you can do yourself. That is probably the only one we've ever consistently done that I've seen a benefit from, which is an overeating disease, Clostridium, which is very, very painful death, but they do have very easy vaccines to give. Things like rabies, there are CL vaccines, which we'll talk about that a little bit more, mastitis vaccines. Rabies is not approved in goats. So if you're doing like an open farm day or something, it doesn't cover them like it would a dog if they were to bite somebody. So just something to consider. But if you're going to fairs, if you do have like open farm days, it's not a bad idea to consider just to keep yourself protected. But CDT we'll talk about more with kidding is the big one for sure. So housing, somebody had asked on WOVA. The biggest thing is shelter. Goats don't like rain. They don't like snow and the wind. Some breeds handle summer better. Some will handle the snow a little bit better, but they want somewhere to get out of it. So if that's a barn, when we had a few goats, we kept them in literally a shed with a ventilation system. So it's pretty easy. It just needs to be draft free. I've had people get wethers from me that just keep them in a calf hut, and they just put something over the door at night during the winter, and they've done very, very well. I've seen like the pallet structures. My biggest concern is goats are destructive. They like to chew on the wood. They like to stand up on things. If you're really good at like handy stuff, the pallet stuff could work, but you just kind of have to make sure it's really strong enough. And then consider like ease of removal for the bedding. So obviously there's going to be hay waste with goats. They're picky eaters. So making sure it's an easy situation for you to get the bedding out of there. Like my barn is a problem because I can't fit a tractor in there. So I fit basically a mini skid steer and clean by hand. So definitely consider that when you're kind of looking at barn setups or however you want to do it. Fencing. So again, goats are destructive just because they like to stand up on fence. They will beat up on things. So I tried to put, I think there's more pictures of my fencing later. But we have basically the fencing we started with outside. It's just like the 4x4 square mesh, the heavier mesh. So that folds up. Occasionally have to repair it, but it works pretty well for ours. We use 6-foot chain link panels for my bucks because we'll get into that. Bucks are a lot more destructive, but if you only have a small herd and you want to give them like a nice little dry lot, that's for at least at night, that's a good place to do it. And then they can certainly jump fences. I've, knock on wood, I haven't had many in my time, but you want to get like a 4.5 foot fence minimum, just to kind of keep them protected, and it keeps any predators fully out as well. And hot wire fence is also a really good idea. You can throw it on the top and bottom and helps with coyotes and foxes and everything. So feeders, there's going to be hay waste. So this is, hello. This is the inside of my barn. I just kind of put a picture of. So we do have livestock guardian dogs. So we have the more open pieces of fence so our dogs can get through to different fields and different pens. But I also really like the mesh one in the back. And these are they're from Tractor Supply. There's different sizes. You just put the clamps on them. So they will rot out at the bottom if you have like a winter pack, but they've worked really well for us since we've moved to this property several years. So, and then the hay rack, again, it doesn't matter what you do. They're going to waste some of the hay. But goats, we'll get into that, are browsers, so they like to eat up high. So I really like these. I put them on the top of the fence. You can do it outside, you can do it inside, and it's just they're naturally more drawn to that. They're not going to eat a pile of hay on the ground. They might, but you're going to get into more parasite issues, and it's just not as good for them naturally. So kind of preparing for breeding season. This is what we're talking about. So quick question, do you guys have goats? Are you considering it or just here to hang out?
Considering.
Okay. So like I told them in Zoom, if you have any questions, let me know, because it's more of a kidding presentation, but I tried to just kind of go over the basics. So if you have questions during, or we can kind of go back to stuff after too. So kind of what is the goal of your herd, like I was saying. So obviously there's goats that are better for dairy, there's goats that are better for market, brush control, utility, pets, obviously they're not as specific at what you like and you like to look at. So depending on, the breed, if you want a milk and a meat goat, Nubians are a good option. Finding genetics that work with you, a better growth weight, maybe does that aren't quite as angular or dairy, which a lot of people say looks that skinnier look, but they're not supposed to have a lot of extra condition as dairy goat. So finding, I don't know if she is actually in here, like I have a line that is, they're hefty girls. So that might be a better for a dual purpose herd. And then what's manageable? So I know we all love animals, and then we, freshen them, and you don't want to get rid of any of the kids. You have to keep in mind, how much can I deal with your, off-farm job, how much room you have, do you have kids? If you are in a town, you have to look at zoning. Do not buy animals before you check into that, or it ends up you have to get rid of them if the town doesn't allow it or your neighbors don't want them there. So a lot of things to kind of consider before you really get any species. So just go to the town. You can Google your town zoning laws and see if there's a maximum number or a maximum like field acreage you can use. So every town's a little bit different. And then obviously, do you have a plan for the market or excess kids if you're going to be breeding? So this is more of a kidding presentation. Or do you have a person who wants to buy market animals? Do you want to process them? Do you have the market for the genetics? And we're lucky in this area, instead of like out west, we have like a pet market here. Goats are more popular. They're all over the internet. So people want to buy a couple of goats just to have in their backyard and, you know, hang out with. So we're in a little bit of an easier area to get rid of extra animals. And then when do you want them, which we'll talk about. Gestation is 5 months. So typically the breeding season when they're naturally in heat, which we'll talk about, is about August to December or January. So 5 months from when I breed them, August will be January kids. So you kind of have to know what your barn setup is, like we talked about. Is it really draft free? Are you going to be dam raising or bottle feeding kids? If you're dam raising, you might want a little bit of warmer weather. And then you have to take into consideration, which I didn't put as much in here until the end, but kind of parasite control. Colder weather is better for parasites because that freeze will kill whatever's in the ground. So kids that are born January through March usually have a much better growth rate because they didn't have to deal with that. After that, it's wet, it's mucky, they're dealing with coccidiosis, which they all have a normal level of that, but they're just kind of competing with more natural elements. And they might grow a little bit slower. So am I going too fast for everybody? Because I know this is a lot to throw at you really quickly. So then when you're finding goats, which is important for everybody here, go to a reputable herd. I know we all want to go to the auction and save all the goats. The thing you have to realize is a lot of these auctions are technically terminal. So when some of these herds are selling there, they may be sending them there for very serious reason. They could have CAE, CL, or Johne's, which are 3 major diseases in goats. CAE is essentially arthritis. They'll start to get swelling in the knees. It can affect kids when they're young and neurologically, things like that. CL is very, very serious abscesses, and it's very transferable if that abscess pops, which again, if animals are frequently going through a sale barn, they're going to be exposed to all of this. It lives in things like wood for in the ground a considerable amount of time. And Johne's is like a wasting disease. So none of these are curable. We have ways to, you know, manage your herd smart to hopefully get rid of it or keep it from your herd, but you don't want to start with this. This stuff lives in your ground for a long time and you want to be really, really careful. G6S and Nubians, which these are Nubians, some of the floppy ears. It could probably be in boars. I don't think there's as much research as any kind of Nubian cross is a neurological mutation. So if you're interested in them, maybe ask. They can either be affected, a carrier, or normal. So normal is they don't carry a copy of that gene. A carrier means they have one set, so they're not affected, but they can pass it on if they're bred to a carrier or an affected animal. So especially if you're looking at getting a buck, make sure he's normal, and then you don't have to worry about testing the does. Just keep breeding to normal bucks and it'll breed itself out over time. And then if you're planning to sell milk, again, we care about the CAE, CL, and Johne's more for the animal's sake more than anything, because things even like Johne's can be in cows. But you also want to consider if you're selling raw milk, there's different laws. There may be different diseases like brucellosis and things that you want to consider testing for or asking who you're buying from, because they're not common to test for, but some people do depending on the situation. And then you want animals with longevity. So you want to find something that is structurally correct. You don't want to have to keep buying replacements. They should be able to be bred and produced into, you know, around 10 years old, give or take, even every year when they're managed well and they're structurally correct. So you want to kind of get your money's worth and not have to have extra animals when one animal can do the same that 4 could when they're more structurally correct. So again, and find a herd that reflects the needs of your farmer family. If you want to get dual purpose animals, find a Nubian. She's actually the doe in that picture is my chubby lady who we'll see later. But she's a really big, heavy goat. She's got crazy width in the chest. She's almost overly conditioned. And that's kind of goat that, you know, if somebody wants a dual purpose Nubian, you buy a buck from her because she's going to help pass that on, especially even if you want to breed it to like boar or cross does. You're still going to have that growth rate and the meat there, but you're also going to have more milk production. So just things to kind of consider. If you're looking for registered animals, which not everybody is, again, I'm more dairy based. There, you can search on AdGo Genetics, any animal's pedigree. So if you look up Hops N Lops, you're going to see every goat I've registered on there. So just make sure that people aren't falsifying papers or they're not saying, oh, they're registered, I'll get you the papers later. You know, phone a friend, email me, somebody to say, does this look right? So go with your gut for sure on any of these situations. So, and there's my lovely chubby lady, it's a dry yearling, who's still just as big of a goat, but lost a little bit of that weight. So talking about preparing for breeding season. So when we talk about condition, we're looking at the age of the animal. When I have does who are 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, I kind of got to say, okay, is she worth breeding? Do we retire this one? Every goat's different. You kind of have to look at them and take into consideration winter's hard on them. If they're already slowing down a little bit, you don't want to breed them through the winter. It's going to take a lot out of them. And then she's my weight problem doe. You don't want really overly conditioned animals, which I wish I had a better picture of her. You can kind of see she's kind of got the dewlap and the jowls and everything. She has quite the reputation already with goat people, but you know, it's hard to get them to actually breed and settle correctly. Sometimes even with under-conditioned animals, if they're not managed well, if they're deficient, which we'll talk about, you're going to have trouble settling them, which isn't going to help your herd at all, your farm. Disease testing. So CAE, CL, Yonis, typically CAE you want to test for, depending on how much you show, you're bringing animals in. Some people do it every year, some people do it every few years, just to kind of make sure your herd is still negative. CL and Yonis, I tell people, you know, test any animals you're bringing in, and they need to be at least 6 months old. I'd say wait until they're closer to 8 to 10 months, just with the younger animals, you know, false positives or negatives. But you definitely want to make sure either before breeding season, since when they're bred, sometimes the hormones can kind of set that off and can give you false positives or even negatives. So it's good to just get that done ahead of time. And they're just easy blood tests. And then supplements and deficiencies. So these are the things that the biggest one is selenium and vitamin E, which is a product called Bosi I might talk about. It's just a sub-Q shot. In this area, we are selenium deficient. So if you're seeing does are not settling right, or goats start to lose their hair, you see it more in the white goats that you'll see, which are Saanens. For whatever reason, they just start to lose their hair when they're deficient. If they're losing hair around their nose or their face, that might just be something as simple as they just need a little bit of selenium. Copper is just basically a tablet you give them. And it's got a bunch of little, almost look like metal pieces. And again, it's just something that is a big deficiency in this area. I usually give it before I breed them, and then maybe once more after they kid, just to kind of get them into the summer and make sure they're not deficient. We're staying on top of it, but the more you give something, the more resistant any animal gets to it. Same with people. So you don't want to overkill, but you also want to stay on top of that. And then you don't want to give it too close to breeding season. If you are, they can lead just to issues with conception. So usually 4 to 6 weeks before you plan to breed them is a safe time. So, and that's the product Bosi. Those are your copper boluses. And then our chubby doe. And preparing the bucks for breeding season. So first of all, not everybody wants or needs a buck. They do smell, they're very big, they can be destructive. So I'll talk about. This guy is a Saanen buck of ours, and he was a 2-year-old in that picture. So they definitely grow very fast. And if you're on a small acreage, or you know, you're more in a neighborhood, you might not want a buck around. So first option, obviously, you can purchase. You can lease a buck, which I get into is not super common. There's disease traceability issues, and I've known people that have leased bucks to people and they don't feed them, and that buck never comes home. So you put a lot of money into the few bucks you have. You want to get the best you can just to improve your herd and improve the genetics. So not everybody wants to lease out a buck. So then there's driveway breeding services. So that means somebody calls me early in the season, hey, my Saanen doe needs to get bred later this year. We don't have a buck. I tell them what disease testing I want and when I want it done for when they're breeding them. And then that way we wait for the doe to be in heat, or they induce them into heat. There's easy hormone protocols if you have a tricky goat or your schedule's crazy like mine is. And they just bring them over, we breed them, they go home, and hope I don't see them in 21 days when she's back in heat. So that's a really good option. It ranges from usually about 40 to 100, maybe a little bit more per breeding. But it's easier than keeping a buck financially and just easier on you. So again, use a quality sire. So even if you're a backyard herd, everyone has a goal. If you're breeding for backyard milk production, you want something that's going to keep that production for you. You don't want to, again, you want one goat that can milk over 10 pounds a day instead of having 3 that are not milking that. It's less feed going into them, it's less animals to deal with, manure waste. So you want to find, you know, if I have a buck that has that production or whatever you needed, that structure, come to my farm instead of just kind of breeding to Farmer Joe down the road. And sometimes we have to. We've all been like, okay, she just needs to get bred and be in milk for next year. But I think it's important whenever we are breeding animals, we're increasing the population. You want to try and do your part and, you know, keeping those breeds quality. And then feed well. So again, it doesn't sound like anybody has bucks, maybe on Zoom. So there's a lot of controversy about feeding bucks in wethers grain. I am a very, very big proponent of they need grain. When bucks are in rut, it takes so much out of them. They just don't want to eat. They pace the fence line. They're fighting with bucks on the that are next door to them. You have to keep them kind of fat going into rut. So again, they really, really, really need that. I like what's called Meat, Goat, and Grow from Blue Seal. And if you look at the label, there's very similar products that every company has. The biggest thing is it needs to contain ammonium chloride, and a 2-to-1 calcium to phosphorus ratio is what helps kind of keep any what we call urinary stones and blockages, which even when you don't feed them grain can still absolutely happen. So I'd rather my bucks be a little bit more conditioned to go into rut. And I think over the years, we have had one buck I've sold, which was not fed the correct grain, and we had one buck of our own ever block. And that was due to the fact that he was not drinking because he was fighting. And that water consumption is very, very important. So a lot of the time on Facebook land, and again, be very careful taking Facebook advice. But you see so many more bucks blocking during the winter. It's because the water buckets are frozen. They're not staying, you know, they're not getting down there to break the ice. They're giving them electric buckets, and they're not getting the water consumption. So there definitely is a factor there, but it's something that a lot of us have noticed over the years. And then quality hay, just like the does. So fresh water again, and supplements, the same thing as the does. I like to give them selenium, vitamin E. I give them copper. Typically, I try to get if I do CDT vaccines, I get it out of the way in the fall for the boys, just so I don't have to worry about them during feeding season. But other than that, I say the boys are pretty easy keepers. It's more, they can be destructive, and they're just, you want to work with them a lot as babies, because when they're this big and, you know, are 3 times your weight, you have to be able to work with them. So finding a bottle baby buck, I really highly recommend. So do you have any questions about what we've talked about so far before we get too much into kidding season?
When you're breeding them and everything,
Mhm.
say you just happen to have a lot of male kids that year,
Yeah.
because it's a bit of a toss up.
Mhm.
Would it work to save them necessarily have them neutered as withers and then save them just to raise as meat for yourself?
Yes,
Okay.
that's what I would say. And like, I
Just
don't
as
for
like
my,
a way to manage the
Exactly.
population.
because there's a lot of people that will, you know, people go crazy. Oh, you raise goats? Do you have buck kids and get them cheap when they're young? But if you're raising that yourself,
Mhm.
I've even considered like getting pigs, because you're going to have extra milk, especially if you have a few does, and they're producing well. You know, it gives you something to kind of keep feeding, and the growth rate's really well. If you watch a coccidiosis and you do a coccidiosis stat, which I'll talk about a little bit, just every couple of weeks you give them that, just to make sure that the quantity of it in their gut stays down. But I mean, I've had kids born January to March that are about 150 pounds by October, November, and those are
Nice.
does.
Nice.
So if you keep pushing grain at those bucks and you grow them out even just to the, you know, early summer,
And then
it-
they'll be fine.
yeah, and that works out for you. You can sell them, you use them yourself. So that's definitely the smart way to do it.
Nice.
So I just tell people, as long as you have the space, use it.
Yeah.
So mine is just time. It's not on my side for that. And let's see, there we go. Okay, so kind of going back to, again, August breeding is January kid. January is going to get you into June. So I definitely, if your barn allows it, try to stay, March is a safe bet, especially early on. And you also, we'll get into this. There are ways to induce out of season heat if you want to do like fall kids sometimes, just depends on your schedule and everything. You can use natural lighting, again, shorten up the days, lock them in earlier, or there's hormone protocols that are very easy to use and pretty consistent. You also want to take into consideration, make sure your buck is actually a little bit ruddy. Maybe bring a doe into heat early, just so he can kind of get a little bit worked up, because otherwise they're interested in the doe, but they're like, this is the season I sit in the barn and do nothing. So you want to make sure they're definitely interested. And then the biggest thing is you want to plan, she might not settle right off the bat. This has been one of those years, and same with last year, that we think has something to do with the grains. It's nationwide is the fact that we have does that are not cycling correctly. So they're, for whatever reason, they might not actually be truly ovulating, though they look like they're in heat. They're just, something is off. So you want to keep in mind that as much as we would love, February, March kids, you may end up with April and May just because you kind of have to figure that out. GnRH is a hormone or sisterelin that is awesome if you're dealing with that it kind of, the doe seems off, the buck is settling, everything else. It's a super easy hormone to talk to your vet about, and a few doses usually clears that up. And again, if they had a bad kidding the year before, maybe something was just a little off internally that no one caught. They're good at walling off things like that. So just a couple tips to go along with it. More reminders. Again, so when it comes to driveway breedings, we did talk about this. Make sure you contact them well in advance. I'm a little bit more type A with it, but I want to make sure you have that health testing. The bucks we're buying are expensive and want to make sure they're healthy and not passing anything to each other. So make sure you talk to me. We're kind of on the same page. Make sure I'm going to be home just with my judging schedule and everything with timing. And then keep in mind, a lot of herds don't offer boarding services. So if you're going to come to my farm to breed a doe, you're taking her home immediately. A couple people do. Again, you're trusting somebody with your animals. Be very cautious. Make sure you really, really trust that person, because I think wars have been started over less than, people keeping each other's goats and everything. And then leasing bucks, again, it's not super common. If you have a friend, maybe they have an extra buck that they were going to sell anyway. But again, if somebody's not interested, don't push it too much. It's not a very common thing to do. And as I said, bucks are very, very destructive. You can see Bert here. That scur is now just sitting on my back step because sometimes they do get a little bit more horn growth, even though we do just bud them. And that can do a lot of damage to your fence. All it takes is them kind of just walking into the wrong way, and they've, put a hole through my chain link panels. So, and then not all of them can live together. So I like to keep my bucks. Usually I'm keeping one or I'm buying one each year, not as much now that we're using artificial breeding a little bit more heavily. But some bucks they don't live together. They can kill each other if you don't watch them, or they get aggressive during rut. So you kind of have to watch it and play it by ear. It's easier to have, I like separate runs with an adjacent fence so they can see each other, but it keeps everyone a little bit happier, everybody's safe. And ours have done really well, even when they've lived with bucks, and then we've, their buddies have gone, we've sold them, but they seem to do a lot better even after that. So if you're bringing in an adult buck, keep them separate. You just never know if they're going to turn during rut or anything. So then signs of heat. So we're getting into breeding season. First thing is they're going to be vocal. If you have a goat that's screaming, she's flagging her tail, or it's just wagging it like a dog. She might have a little bit of drainage. This is going in order, I remember. That's going to be your sign she's in heat. Sometimes you get into weird things like they're pacing. They might be pacing the fence line. Like you can see, I don't know, way in the back, there's our actual doe field, and they sit down the end of that and just pace back and forth and stare at the bucks and, are miserable and tease each other. So, and the other weird one, sometimes does are very silent with their heats, but their personality will change. If she's very nervous, she might be friendly. My first goat ever would beat the crap out of my mother, but we would know she's in heat because my mom would go up and pet her. So again, sometimes you got to keep notes of all of this, have a notebook, just kind of remember, okay, she did this last year. Maybe she's, will continue that same trend. So again, fast forward a little bit. So confirming pregnancies, blood test is the easiest way to do this. It's cheap. You can do it yourself. Even when you do your disease testing, have your vet or have somebody show you how to draw blood. It's one of the easiest things to do. But you also want to consider doing, your disease testing at the same time. You can send them directly to the lab yourself. Ultrasound, which is what that is. So you always want to confirm when a doe is open via ultrasound, they're not 100%. So you want to go back and blood test just to make sure that she actually is open. You didn't just miss something. I'm very fortunate. We own our own ultrasound machine. I don't think everybody should own an ultrasound, but they're becoming more popular. So I'm kind of able to just practice a little bit more. Hello. And then, so milk test. So we have somebody come in to test our milk, well, to weigh the milk and to see what the does are producing every month. And you can use the sample they take to look at stomatic cell, which is basically, you know, if there's any, not quite infection, but how clean the milk is. Goats tend to be a little bit higher, but also the butter fat and the protein. But they can test that for a couple extra dollars too, and that seems to be pretty accurate. Then there's urine test. Do not buy these. They are not accurate. I did an experiment a couple years ago, and we had a weather at the time. I tested old retired does. I tested does that I knew were pregnant, and there was no consistency. So don't even, just go to the blood test. So coming a little bit farther, so gestation is 150 days or 5 months. The window is 145 to 155. Technically, they could go a little bit less than this. It gets a little bit sketchy with preemies and everything. I know people have had does go more than 155. I don't do that because if they have a big single buck kid and it's a first freshener, it can get very dicey as well. So there are ways to kind of very safely induce them, but definitely try to stay within that window, hopefully, and try not to go above 155 days. So feeding, there's a lot of ways to do this. Some people take them off grain once they're done milking for the year. I like to keep my does. I feed them grain in the pen every night, and they get it as a group. And then my milkers get grain on the stand. It's higher protein grain. They get whatever they want while they're milking. I like to keep them on grain in the pen year round. I think it's less of a shock when you do start to feed them. If you take them off grain and then do start to prior to kidding, I think you see more issues with basically like ketosis and just everything's a little bit off. And if she's having a set of quads or even more, if you have Nigerian dwarf goats, they can crash very quickly. So I like to try to keep things consistent and then just increase grain rather than give them grain all of a sudden again. Does that kind of make sense?
Question.
Yes.
Are goats susceptible to milk sickness?
Like
Because-
milk fever?
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. They definitely can.
Is that a calcium thing for them? Because I've got two own dairy cows, and that's something they watch for all the time.
Are they probably Jersey breeders too,
Yeah.
the brown ones? Yeah. We don't see it as much. We definitely do see it. I don't think, again, knock on wood, I have not had a case, or at least not a bad case, but there are ways to give them calcium.
Mhm.
The biggest thing, I think I have the next slide, is like, as they get closer to kidding, you got to watch. If they're a little bit off, just something doesn't seem right, they're not going to the grain as aggressively, that's when we really start watching does. You can
Mhm.
test the calcium and the glucose and everything, even using like people, those little tabs. So
Mhm.
definitely it's not a huge concern, but that's why I like to keep them on the grain, is let's keep everything as normal as possible, because when you take them off of it and not realize that she's having quads, like
Yeah.
it just shocks their system. So again, I'm very spoiled. I have an ultrasound machine. They can reabsorb up to about 45 days pregnancy. So sometimes, you know, if you can, she has to come back in the heat. I'm impatient. I scan them around 30 days, but it doesn't hurt to go back or wait until about 45 days and blood test just to make sure she's bred, especially it's early in the year. You have time to rebreed them if they're open. But again, I've had friends that have had does abort around 60 days, which occasionally they get into a fight. They find a plant they're not supposed to, things happen. But usually after about 45 days or so, I think I have that on here, you would notice it. There's going to be blood of some sort, or just some kind of drainage. You might find the kids. If you have livestock guardian dogs or anything like that, you have to consider they could get into it. They could clean up a doe. So if they look a little bit off during pregnancy, like they don't look as big as they did, they're not quite growing like you thought, sometimes it doesn't hurt to like pull blood again if you're going to be testing other does. So again, watch for bullying within the herd. They can be nasty things when they want to be and pick on each other, especially, you know, during pregnancy and after they freshen. There's always a hierarchy. There's a herd queen and they have their own little buddies if your herd is big enough, and they will pick on each other because they want to move up that ladder, especially as they get older. So just kind of keep an eye on that. I've had to keep does in different pens. I have a certain tone they know that I use, and everyone goes and hides and behaves themselves. So again, it's like having kids. And then, well, before they kid or even before breeding season, you have to decide if you want to dam raise or bottle feed. So typically the easiest thing to do is to dam raise and leave them on the doe. We bottle feed, I'll talk about that a little bit. If you have animals that are positive for different things, you're going to want to bottle feed and raise on pasteurized milk, which I'll get into as well. Bottle feeding is very intensive, but at the same time, I tell people I'm not worrying that kids are eating in the barn, that the doe is actually taking care of them. She's not excluding one of the kids. So there's a lot of kind of pros and cons to that, and you just have to decide what works best for your situation. So then getting a little bit closer to kidding, you want to dry off any milkers about 60 days prior. A lot of the time, especially more of a homestead situation, they're going to be dried off prior to that, but you want to give them a time just to kind of use all that grain and all that energy towards growing those kids. And heavy milkers, occasionally we have Saanens that milk anywhere around 20 pounds a day. Sometimes those does are going to milk through a little bit, even if I'm milking them every couple of days. You don't want to leave them and let mastitis sit or anything. So sometimes it's just safer to kind of milk them through. So watch them carefully, just like I said, anything like ketosis, milk fever, just if does look like, or they're possibly going to have quads, keep an eye on them. I'm one, I don't change grain based on how many kids they have. And bigger herds, it makes sense. For mine, it's just I'm able to kind of know if somebody looks like they need a little bit more energy, they look a little bit off, I kind of base it on that. So yeah.
So one thing that I've noticed that could be a flaw with goats is that in order for them to produce milk, they must reproduce first.
Yep.
But you don't know if they're the ones you want to reproduce until they produce milk.
Yep.
So I thought of some creative solutions to that problem, but do you have any that you'd recommend?
So what I would recommend, kind of what we talked about, is always finding the best buck you can. So what we call proving bucks, what the real term of that is bucks who their daughters have been structurally evaluated, they've been linear appraised, and they've been on milk test. So we have a basis that we can have data that's going to tell us if that buck, what he's improving and how he could help your herd. So if you have a doe that, maybe her udder, the attachment isn't as good, you could look at this list and be like, oh, this buck, all of his daughters are these really nice high, maybe there's more production in that mammary system, just the whole muscle attachment is better. So I think the thing is, which isn't realistic for everybody, AI sires and using bucks, even the ones that are dead but have 100 daughters that are tested and all of that, you can use him in a more strategic way, but obviously not many people do that. So in that case, you go to the best herd you can. And sometimes that's somebody local and just say, hey, I really like these genetics. And you kind of look at the pedigree and all the female relatives. And, they might recommend work with this one. He will help your herd in this way. He should. But it's always a gamble because sometimes you buy the best buck out there and they don't work out for you for sure. So do you have a theory on that though? Or your method to it?
Oh, I haven't kept goats yet.
Okay.
But what I was thinking of trying to do is get goats that have other uses as well.
Yep.
And I could judge them on their other uses. This is first, and then once they do start producing milk, they judge them on that.
Yep. And even we kind of talked about too, even in your younger animals, so the babies and the dry yearlings, you can still see a lot of the structure. And I'll have pictures I can point it out.
So what I was saying is like let's say, like I'm interested in goats for like transportation and packing animals as well. So if I could get goats to do both, then I could do them first on that and then milk them later.
Yep.
Yeah.
There you go. You got a game plan now.
But your suggestion as in favorite bucks by genetics.
Yeah, I'm a genetics person, so that's where my brain always goes. But anyway, so getting back to this, because I'm sure I have some post pictures I can show you. We can talk about that. 4 to 6 weeks prior, CDT vaccine. I will say there's only a few people here. There are some concerns out there. I have not had this with the brands I use of does. It's causing them to start to abort when you give it. So there's people that are giving it closer to kidding. I use a brand called Vision CDT. I don't think I have a picture of it. I've used it. I got it from a friend who worked at Redwood Hills Dairy on the West Coast, and they have a ton of kids every year, and she's worked with some other big herds. So again, I always say ideally do it on the left side. So CDT vaccines can cause a little bit of a reaction. Not always, sometimes it's a little bit of an abscess or just kind of a quiet one, but always know where you put it. So if you want to take them to a show, you want to go somewhere with them, you could say, no, we give our CDT there. That's not an abscess or CL. And I tell people if you show them, we walk in clockwise. If you do on the left, it's on the outside. We're still going to see it. It doesn't really matter, but that's my theory with the left. So again, it's Clostridium. There's different types. There's also, I know, a Clostridium type A. It's not as big of a deal. I know I've seen it more in Wisconsin. People talk about it and wanting to like vaccinate for it, but the C and D is the biggest one. And it also has tetanus in it. So 2 to 4 weeks prior is BOC, which is selenium, vitamin E. Again, you have to be careful. These things can typically cause abortion. I do a very low dose. So it's like 1 ml to 40 pounds. So I usually give about 2.5. My doses are really big. I also have a scale, so I can be really specific. So I never give them the full dose, and then I give them one after they freshen. And then copper again. Copper is usually pretty safe when they're pregnant. And 1 to 2 weeks prior, some people might do this earlier. I like to do it a little bit closer to kidding, so I don't have to bother them after. They can get used to being on the stand. They can do what they want. They have an attitude after they freshen, I find. So I do like a sanitary or dairy clip, which I will show. I think I have pictures of it. Essentially, you can just clip the udder with like a 40 or 50 blade, which is more surgical. You don't have to go that short, but it just cleans it up. If you're dam raising, the kids can find the udder a little bit easier. And if you're milking, it's keeping your equipment and your milk cleaner. A lot of the time, which we'll talk about what ligaments in the tailhead are after, but you can kind of clean up right around the rump and the rear legs. The rear legs just help them stay clean with all the goo and everything. Around the tailhead, there's ligaments that loosen prior to kidding, which I have a picture of, so it can kind of help you see that a little bit easier. And then trim hooves. Like I said, I just like to get it done closer to kidding so I can leave them for another 6 weeks after and not have to bother them. And then consult your vet about dosages. Again, things are always changing. There might be new research coming out. So again, I have a really good relationship with my vet. It's find somebody who you can text, you can call. They don't have to come out every time because large animal vets, they want to teach you how to do things. They can't make every call, and we're so short on large animal vets right now. They want to help us kind of learn how to do these things on our own. And continuing to lead up to kidding, raise your water buckets. They can accidentally kid into a bucket and drown a kid. Have not had that happen, but it is, again, always in the back of my mind, remind people if you have them on the ground in the pen. I have mine basically where the doe's sticking her head through. I have them on the other side of one of them so they can reach it. I have a couple in the pen that are hung up so that it's high. It's a little bit, it's higher for them to get in. They can kind of reach their neck over, but it's above the tail. Clean the barn and our kidding pens. You have to know, like when I do in my herd, again, we pull kids, so it's a little bit easier. I don't need to put them in their own stall. That would be more just a cleanliness thing for me. Usually I pull them out of the pen. I have a little area I kid them out in. We pull the kids out. I can put the doe back. She's happy. They're happy. Clean that up and be ready. If I have 5 does kidding that day, it's basically just like a big line. I also will occasionally kid them out in the pen. I don't like separating them because I think they're happier when they're in that group. Any kind of stress is going to stall labor. So if you're throwing them in the kidding pen right before they kid, that can kind of slow things down. And I just want to let them be, let them relax. Some does want me there. Other does like to, or just progress better when I'm not. So you kind of have to just read attitudes and figure out what works for you. And again, like if you have barn cameras, I have them all over the place, but sometimes it's easier just to have one over a line of kidding pens. So everyone's situation is different. And have a kidding kit ready to go. Basically, we'll get into that. I have 3 things that end up in that I really need for any kidding, or 4 things, and I just throw them in a laundry basket so I can run that down, throw the kids in a laundry basket, run them back to the house. But it keeps everything together. And if you teach them how to read things and when they're supposed to be doing things, it helps. Hasn't worked yet, but we're trying. So getting into kidding supplies. And again, there's a billion things I could put on this list. These are kind of my most important. Emergency phone numbers. Have your vet, if you're new, tell your vet, hey, I'm going to have goat stew around this time, just so they know, like, if you're calling, it's about that. And experienced people, I have a couple people close to me that, you know, I'm their emergency call if they need another opinion or they can't get a kid out. Maybe it wants to work. There we go. Bath towels. So you can use paper towels. I've seen people put them on like they don't have them as much anymore, but the paper grain bags help too because it's easy to throw out and be done. I like bath towels. We're kidding out early. It's cold. Yes, it's a pain to have to wash everything, but you know, it's less expensive over the years to just keep using them. Lubricant, if you have to go in and move kids around, which we'll talk about that in a second. There's a product called J-Lube. Be very careful with it. There's been issues with it kind of sitting in does uteruses. So I've used it in the past a long time ago without an issue, but there's a lot of lubricants out there to use. Even human lube works. And nasal aspirator, which is that is my favorite thing on the planet. Just as they come out, wipe that kid's face off. I kind of stimulate them. I rub them with the towel, and then I use that to get any goo out of their nose. Especially if you're doing disease prevention, you want to get that goo. Any kind of fluid can transfer things. So again, I say don't keep goats if you don't have to that are positive for things, but you want to get all of that out of their nose and out of their face quickly. So I have a billion of these just so we have extras at all times. Dental floss, that's what you're going to tie off the umbilical cord with. And then you're going to dip it in 7% iodine. There's products you can spray, and I can't think of the name of them off the top of my head. The 7% is the best. It dries it out a lot better. It works faster. It can be messy, so be careful, but it's definitely by far the best product to use. And then even if you're dam raising, you never know when a doe is not going to take care of kids. Have a bottle, nipple, and replacer handy. Worst case, you can sell or give the replacer to a friend if you don't need the bottle. And then milking supplies. Again, even if you're dam raising, you never know when you're going to have to milk that doe out because she doesn't want to take care of her kids. So just be safe. And a few other things, a head snare, which I have pictures of later. I think I've used it once and not even for the intended purpose. It was trying to keep a foot forward. It's just basically a thing you can put in and get the head forward if they're kind of wanting to put their head back during delivery. A lot of different kinds, but I'll show the one I really like. ID bands are up there. If you have a breed of goat that are all the same color, like Saanens, the white ones, when you have a billion white babies born at the same time, that doesn't go very well. So we do tattoo pretty quickly when I just bud my kids, but it's always good to have those handy, you know, which order they were born, you know, who you fed, and if somebody's acting a little bit off, it's easier to communicate that. Scissors if the umbilical cord's too long. Make sure you tie it off first. And then electrolytes for your doe. Again, molasses water, warm molasses water, they love that. Some like electrolytes, which there's powdered ones. You can get Gatorade, powder or liquid. Every dose I found, my Nubians like molasses water and my Saanens like Gatorade better. So I have everything on hand. Just if a doe is down, if she's not doing well, even just to have your goats for the summer, always have electrolytes on hand. Banamine, it's a pain reliever and anti-inflammatory. I don't like to give it right after kidding, more for my own like weird theories of I want to make sure that, you know, the muscles and everything is doing what it should. They should pass the afterbirth. I don't want them retaining something. So, and usually they bounce back well, but I like to give it to them 24 hours later, or if they have a really bad kidding, I'm going to give it to her immediately. And again, if it's a kid or somebody spikes a fever, that is something I think everybody should have on hand. You get it from your vet. Antibiotics, again, to each herd their own. I think it's very important because you never know when you're dealing with uterine infections. Does can freshen with very serious mastitis, and you've got to be on it fast. So definitely have a good relationship with your vet to kind of keep all of that in mind. And actually, I want to point out, so the little things, those are pill bottles, and that's what I dump my iodine into. So I kind of like pick the kid up, I have them in a tote, and I put that on the umbilical cord, and I kind of just flip them over really quick. They hate it, but it's a faster and a cleaner way to do it. So disease prevention, if you are dealing with something like CAE, They shouldn't be dam raising on the kids. You want to try and get that under control. And it's something that is manageable, but you got to keep those positive animals away from the negative. Usually a 6-foot minimum space between fence lines is recommended. You don't want them taking any kind of raw milk. Try to keep them away from any birthing fluid as much as you can. Again, it's a common practice. This is a bunch of babies we had on a very long weekend. But even though we're negative, we still do this. My goats were off site. They're going to shows. You never know when somebody spilled a little bit of milk in their water bucket at the show and somebody could come out positive. And again, does shouldn't be allowed to lick the kids if they're positive. You just don't want them looking around the face and getting any kind of fluid. The thing, I'm not big, especially if you're gonna bottle feed. I don't like to let the kids or the does lick them too much, which everybody's their own opinion, but I think it helps a lot more. I actually like to let the does lick any fluid off my arm. I want them bonding with me just as the person who's milking them. I found this really helps a lot. And honestly, my does don't, we've just bottle fed for so long. They're really not interested in the kids. So ask whoever you're buying from. If you want a dam raised, ask them, make sure you say that, because they might have a line that's not good with it. And they may have lines that are really good and want to raise those kids and are stealing kids from other does. So those are kind of some of those little questions to ask people. So if you do have a positive herd or you want to raise on prevention, heat treating colostrum, which is really the first milk. I say it's typically the first 24 to 48 hours. You want to have it at 135 degrees for an hour. So put it in a pot with a top on, get it to that temperature. You could use, there's different pasteurizers you can use, and I can't think of the other one. But there's different ways to do it. Some people will just keep it. There's a product you can use and put these little plastic balls on the top, and it'll keep it just circulating. So you have to keep it at that temperature though. If you go too high when you're trying to heat treat colostrum, it turns to pudding, which we've all done, and I still do it constantly. If they're kind of in between having colostrum and milk, I dump it just because I find it's easier to just not waste milk, because if there's colostrum when you're trying to pasteurize, which is 165 degrees, for so many seconds, I usually leave it on for a few minutes or forget about it. It's 180 and it's fine. But if there's colostrum in there, it's going to ruin it. So usually there's a little period where I'll dump a dose milk just to save that. We're doing okay on time. Okay, so those are the ligaments I'm talking about in that white doe. So I will say, I noticed my Swiss breeds, which are the ones with the upright ears, there's not as much change in the ligaments prior to kidding. And I think it has to do with the rump structure. The line that's kind of on the outside, we call the thurl, is a little bit higher and more where it's supposed to be, versus on the Nubians. And that's a LaMancha in that picture. They're a little bit lower. So I think it's just everything is more noticeable when it starts to loosen and sink in than some. So something just to kind of keep in mind while you're looking at your own animals. But I always look for that right off the back is the loosening. Sometimes they'll get a little bit of a raised tail head, it'll have an arch to it. So eating less or not eating, if they start to go off feed, definitely start to watch them. And I have some does that will eat through labor. So again, take notes, you have to know your own goats. Drainage, which we'll talk about. Nesting, the doe closest to me on the bottom. They'll kind of start like hitting all the bedding out of the way. They want to make a little area. They're not making a nursery, but again, that's their own version of it. So bagging up or the udder filling. My does don't get as much milk when they kid. It's a slower process. Some does, like they get to the point where you have to milk them out prior to kidding because they're so full. Again, depends on the genetics. You kind of have to know your animals, but that is a sign to watch for. If they all of a sudden, even if they aren't super full, get milk, you got to watch them for signs of kidding. So active labor, again, we're getting into a little bit more gooey pictures. So that video, we'll see if it actually moves again, is just a doe pushing, and that's when I kind of start to take them seriously. Some will kind of push here and there. That was a doe that was, again, just about to have her kids. So 4 signs are wide-eyed and staring. I can still talk today. So once they kind of, the doe in the top corner, eyes are super dilated. She kind of looks like she's seen a ghost. That's when I know, okay, we're getting much closer. They're actually in labor and having contractions. Pushing a head against a wall. Again, that's a pain response. Some does will kind of do that as they get a little bit closer. And long string of drainage, yellow or amber colored. So obviously that bottom one, that's when they're in labor. That's the mucus plug and tells you those kids should be there relatively soon. Some people will notice they might lose them a little bit earlier. I've never found that to be the case. So again, take notes for your own herd, but the one in the center on the bottom is another doe who is in active labor and starting to push, but how her tail is kind of pushed up. She's kind of up on her front legs. Those are all signs that, again, just a little bit of distress and pain. So you want to watch those because those are in labor and obviously pushing. And then separate, you definitely want to get her separated if you haven't at this point and plan to. So this is just kind of a slow progress. This is one of my does that tricked me. I thought she was going to kid maybe in 2 or 3 hours, and 15 minutes later I walked down, she had her kids. So, but see how her tail is up, her back is kind of arched, and her rear legs, you want to look at the angle of the rear legs because they're going to start to straighten as they have contractions on them. So obviously we're starting to push. That is a kid. So there's going to be a water bubble, obviously. And then the darker colored one on this one where it's kind of more of a cloudy, that's when you're dealing with a kid. Sometimes you'll see the nose, you'll see a hoof as they progress. Then we pull our kids and then you have babies. So, and this is the important thing to talk about is dystocia. Does anyone know what dystocia means? Okay, so dystocia is essentially when there's any kind of, they're not presenting like they should. They should be in a diving position. And that doesn't mean their legs should be all the way forward. They should be kind of back. The nose should be even with their knee. And one leg might be a little bit staggered. So basically that is the easiest way to pass them. They don't always come out like that. And for one reason or another, I don't find it to be as much genetics. It's if there's 3 kids in there, they're going to fight to get out and somebody's going to kind of get shoved to the side and not be positioned correctly. So 9 out of 10 times you shouldn't have to help. I'm more hands-on, I'll be the first one to say it. But you need to kind of know when to call the vet, when to call your friends. I've FaceTime people when they've had their goats in labor and talked them through it. So usually it's an easy fix. But after a few minutes of serious pushing, this could be 15, 20 minutes. Some people wait longer. If they're starting to kind of stall, they're not pushing as much. They're, just something looks off. She looks like she's in a little bit more distress. That's when you might want to go in and check. I've told people, and I think a lot of vets are even missing this, if they're starting to really want to raise their hips and they're not pushing anymore, and they're starting to kind of be very straight in their rear legs, that tells you something is stuck. It's really, really important to take that seriously because all it takes sometimes is just moving something a tiny bit and they can finish having them, or you can get them out pretty quickly, but you have to be on top of things. So again, pushing head against the wall. Usually if they weren't doing it, they've been pushing, they're in more pain, they're raising their hips a little bit. That's telling you something's going on if they're starting to push their head against the wall done. And so before stepping in, you want to make sure you cut your nails. So you don't want to just tear the uterus or any lining. Try to take nail polish off just because it harbors a little bit more bacteria. Sanitize your hands, use some kind of lubricant. I really like the OB, the AI sleeves that go all the way up. I don't always use them. Sometimes I try to, and I'm like kitting out multiple does, but sometimes you just can't get a grip. So make sure, your nails are clean and everything, and you're ready to go if you have to grab kids. Maybe it wants to work. Okay, so very quickly, we have 15 minutes. So normal presentation. Again, that's exactly what you want to see. If it's 1 foot and the other one's back, it's fine. You can kind of help and pull that front leg a little bit more. But typically I really want to see 2 feet and a nose right behind them at the knee. So again, normal presentation, same thing. It makes my life easy if one leg is really far back. Sometimes when you're dealing with this, you might just want to pull that front leg a little farther forward and even them out. Just very careful, very slow. You don't want to puncture through the uterus or anything. So I tell people just kind of take your time and don't worry. Call a friend, even if you just need some like moral support dealing with it. So breech, obviously, easiest thing is just like in that second picture is to start to pull very, very carefully, push the top of that hop back and pull the leg, the hoof out. And sometimes you can just do it with one leg and just go with it. Do want to get them out quickly in this case, because if that cord breaks, they're going to start breathing. So a little bit more of a faster situation than the last. And this one, again, you're typically not going to get them out with just a tail. So that's where you want to slowly kind of get the foot moving back, just like in the second one, and keep the hoof going back. Maybe, there we go. And breech presentation, exactly. Again, just reach in and grab that rear leg, upside down, same thing. And I tell people, close your eyes and just picture it. You know, if you stare at goats every day, you know, goat anatomy, you can kind of see, figure out, okay, that's a hock or is that a knee on the front leg? So things like that. And again, this is kind of getting into using a snare, which some tying it, people have even used like baling twine. Again, you probably want to give antibiotics if you're going to use that, but the head snare we'll talk about, you can use just like that to keep legs back. And life is like a box of chocolates, never know what you're going to get. There's a billion different ways they're going to present, and I've had probably just half at this point. So yeah, don't panic. Kidding season is not as stressful as I think people make it out to be. It's, you just got to roll with it and have your friends on call. So this is a head snare. And I need to get one just like this because I have a bigger, bulkier one. So essentially, it's just going to be something with a loop on the end, just like she's doing in these pictures as you put your hand through. So if you need to go in and a kid's keeping her head back or to the side, you want to get it over the back of the head, around the ears, assuming it's a breed that has more external ear. If you want to get it on a leg, just again, make sure that noose looking thing is a little bit smaller to get it on there, but it can be a lifesaver, especially if you're trying to deal with a doe. It's been 45 minutes, you can't feel your hand anymore. It can definitely save you. So quickly getting to the end of this, but after care, so make sure you milk the doe. Even if you're dam raising, it doesn't hurt to take a little bit out, especially if she's really bagging up. Go right back to that electrolyte water. And watch for afterbirth. Typically they should pass it within 24 hours. Usually mine pass it very quickly, if not within a couple of hours. I don't like to let them eat it because they can choke. Sometimes they do, or again, dogs will get to it if you have livestock guardian dogs or dogs there. And don't let them step on it. So I don't know if you can see it as well. I do tie the end of it sometimes so it's not this huge string and somebody else doesn't step, just because again, it is attached to the uterus. Want to make sure it's actually getting past and we're not tearing anything. So again, that is bottom a doe literally 2 minutes after she had kids and one of my older girls, and usually they bounce back very, very quickly. It's a little bit rougher, it might take a little bit more time, but I baby them if in that case, give them a little bit of grain, bring them that bucket of water really close, and especially first fresheners might just need a little bit extra TLC and just sit with them for 10 minutes. And then again, if you're dealing with something like a uterine tear, it doesn't happen often. Sometimes they just do, whether or not you're assisting. About 24 to 48 hours is where you're watching them. Usually if something is going to go bad, it will be quickly, but that's kind of, if you have a rough kidding, you really want to watch them for that 48 hours just to be safe. Milking supplies, this is kind of a dairy clip. I really didn't clip the rear legs on these two, but you can see how we trim up the udder just so it's cleaner. You can see what's going on, not as much dirt in the milk. So you want to have a pre-dip or dairy wipes. I honestly like the iodine-based pre-dips. You can get at Tractor Supply for cheap. You mix it with water. I do like the dairy wipes to keep things cleaner if you're showing, but yeah, the pre-dip at home. Stainless steel bucket, easier to disinfect, and a post-dip. There's a lot of different kinds out there. I usually buy some kind of iodine-based one online. There's some at Tractor Supply. I don't think they're as effective. Even Fight Back though will work really well. Yep.
So for pre-dip, I usually use soap and water.
Mhm.
But is that not good enough anymore?
It wouldn't work on it wouldn't pass like a dairy inspection. So the thing with water can also cause mastitis depending on the temperature, what the water's been introduced to. I really like what makes my life easy is there's spray bottles. So there's the cups you can actually dip the water or iodine on the teat, but there's spray bottles that have a long nozzle. So all I have to do is go over the back or on the side and I just spray the iodine on the whole base of the udder, let it sit for a second. And then I just use paper towels and take it off. So I would use, there's like chlorhexidine solutions that are better than soap and water. But again, if it's working for you.
I haven't done it yet.
Yeah, I would definitely use something chlorhexidine or iodine. It's gonna make that a lot cleaner. Especially if you're drinking the milk, you want to make sure that teat's really clean. And then a mitt cream, especially after kidding. If they're dealing with congestion, there's a lot of swelling, there's several on the market, different price ranges, but definitely good to have on hand. And even if you use it daily or just after kidding. A strip cup is just a little metal cup with a really fine filter. Usually, I don't use it every day. I use it every couple of days, but you just want to get the first couple streams of milk to help catch mastitis early. So if there's usually after kidding, first fresheners, there might be a little bit of kind of tissue in there. It's basically like excess scar tissue. But if you start noticing little things of blood, which sometimes it's just the udder, it's just the capillaries breaking, but you want to kind of really catch that as soon as you can, and that helps a lot. And first 24 hours, so make sure they get colostrum within an hour is best. Dip that umbilical cord, just like we talked about. I do like to give Bosi, especially in Saanen. I think it helps if you're dealing with any kind of like white blood cell disease or anything, that does help that as well. Check the teats and orifices, especially if you're selling kids or you're going to keep something as a breeding replacement. Want to make sure they have one orifice, which is just the hole in the bottom of the teat, and they should only have one teat. You don't want to see 4. Again, if it's a market animal, it's not as important, but dairy or bucks, you want to make sure there's no like spur teat where there's one and then there's something coming off. So again, just sometimes it helps make those breeding decisions really easy when you have kids like that. And then check for things like a cleft palate. I've still never seen one in our own animals, but if a kid is really off or anything like that, start looking for signs of things like that. And you have to take it in consideration. We are breeding animals and you never know when something's going on internally. So if a kid's off, sometimes there could be something more going on. Just kind of touch base with your vet about it. Land bar training, which I think there's a picture of it. Basically, there's buckets with a bunch of nipples around it, and they have these tubes that go in. And so instead of having to feed everybody an individual bottle, we like to train ours to go on the land bar. You do have to be careful. They can overeat, so you kind of have to make sure. I like to feed them in their bigger groups and just feed them so many times a day. So if somebody's sitting on the bucket and I can see if somebody else isn't eating, I can pull that kid who's eating too much off and they're not going to have any overeating problems. Whoop. And then over the first 8 weeks, just kind of some reminders. If you're going to disbud, usually you want to do it by about 10 days old. The earlier you do it, the less tissue and nerve endings they have there. But it just depends on the kid. I always give either tetanus. I like to give the CDT vaccine to kids when I do that, as well as Banamine. Check teats and orifices again. Make sure they have 2 testicles. If you're going to have bucks, they're not retained. Make sure you check that if you're going to ban them before you do. Get them tattooed as early as you can, just so if you have marked breeds, you know who is who. And you're not having a DNA type if you want to register. Really quickly, coccidiosis prevention or coccidia. Again, they all have a normal level in their gut, but when you're dealing with later kids, if they're scouring, you're dealing with diarrhea, they may just need a treatment. And I really like the product called Albon, which is hard to get now. It used to be in a smaller pill form. Now it's liquid. There's some other. Corid isn't bad, but it doesn't work for everybody. If it works, fantastic. It's cheap, it's easy to use. But talk to kind of your vet and see what's working in your area and things like that. But there are products like Calf Pro, and I've used it with really good success. And then I've had kids have very bad reactions from a very subtle overdose. And I've seen a lot of other people start to say the same thing. So I think the concentration may be off. So just be very cautious if you see them online, kind of use at your own risk. These aren't that, the Calf Pro is not a goat product. You want to get them started on hay and grain. When you're dealing with coccidiosis, always get them on a medicated grain. So that meat, goat, and grow. It has the big scary red medicated. That just means it has something for coccidiosis. It's not any crazy. You got to check if you're using them for market, but it's so helpful to get them on that from a young age to help kind of teach them to fight that. I do weather when they're younger. Some people don't like to weather till they're several months old. I think it's kind of pushing the line of inhumane in some cases when we're getting to 6-8 month old weathers. So I like to do them at a couple weeks old, definitely before my weathers leave, unless someone has a different opinion on it and wants to do it themselves. And then register. Technically, you need to be registering them prior to leaving unless they're getting a tag instead of a tattoo. Just there needs to be traceability. So if you're using an EID or a tattoo, it needs to be associated with a registration paper. But like market goats or boar, even the boar registry, they use tags. So as long as it's a scrapies tag through the state, you're fine. And then for ADGA, I will say we are getting into mandatory DNA typing. So if you're selling dairy goats, buck kids, you probably want to consider doing that, or at least remind the buyer. And now we got through that. We have 4 minutes. Any questions?
Grace, that was amazing.
Thank you.
So
I'm
much
glad you made it
information.
through that one. So, and I do have, if you want to email me, feel free to reach out with questions. I know I'm definitely the kind of person, I will think of questions, 2 weeks later. So my phone number is on my website, but it's definitely kidding season. Email me. I may respond at weird hours of the night. So.
Yeah, any questions, please, please get them out now.
So, yeah, I would like to, I'm thinking I might, get like, the thing with someone earlier was I can't start milking as soon with that plan. So that would, I might just get some goats that I can start milking sooner, and some goats I can use as muscle parts,
Yeah, I would say if you want to do like pack or anything, I would say get a wether or two to start. Those are going to be easier. They're a little bit bigger, so the packs just fit better on them. But even like a Nubian wether would be really good. I've sold a lot that do packing and carting. So, and even it kind of teaches you management. So if you want to get into market goats, you want to get into dairy goats, that's your easy learning course on, okay, this feed works for my area, this hay doesn't. And then you kind of look into getting dairy goats too, if you want to do milk.
Well, I want to do both.
Yep.
This one has Nubian or cross goats, so I was thinking of getting some for the head.
Yep. Yeah, the one thing, if you want milk, you want to make sure you talk to him and find something that does milk. Because a lot of the time when you're dealing with like a boar breeder, the only milk production they're dealing with is when they're feeding kids.
Yes, so this one's a hybrid, but it's like 3/4 Nubian. Nubian, it's about 3/4 Nubian, 1/4 Boer.
Yep. So that you should have a little bit more production. I will say Nubians are not always the best producers. So you want to make sure that whatever Nubian is in there is still really producing. So just kind of questions, make sure, ask him, is he milking them? Or are they in milk for 8 weeks? Or are they in milk for, typically the normal lactation of a dairy goat's 305 days. Not everybody does that. I don't every year, or I only milk a couple that long or through. But you want to make sure that there's like a lactational curve. So the longer they're in milk, they should kind of go up in production, and then they'll start to go down in the fall. So if they're not milking them long term, they might not know. So just something to kind of look at. I'll make sure.
Is there, so if you wanted to use some of them for brush control, because
Yep.
especially like in Connecticut, there's a bajillion brambles and vines and everything.
Yep.
Would you want to keep the dairy goats out of that? Would you want to keep them on a cleaner pasture, or are they all pretty hardy?
The biggest thing is you might see a little bit of a difference in the taste depending on what they're eating. But if that doesn't bother you, you should be fine.
Okay.
Our herd, again, we don't drink the milk as much. A lot of it ends up going to the kids, or in soap making. But it definitely, you will notice a little bit of a change in the taste depending on that. But you also change it, see a taste change during breeding season too, because they might get a little bit bucky scent. So I wouldn't worry too much. Ours eat just about everything and have killed down the brush.
And then one other question, because I didn't realize Mount Laurel was poisonous to
Yes.
them. Is there a way that we can, because we're in Connecticut and I know it's protected.
Yeah.
Is there a way to legally remove it from an area other than people just not knowing that it was there in the first place?
I mean, I haven't heard of one because we had the same issue when we lived before, and it was okay, we're keeping them away from this. But I mean, it's kind of, if nobody knows, but at the same time, if you're able to kind of even hot wire that off, if they're out or if it's in the pen, kind of take the fence around it.
I mean, I guess it's good that it's basically a tree. It's a little easy to spot.
Yeah, or even just keep it really high and take the leaves.
Yeah.
Keep it really.
Do I need to know about all the plants that are poisonous to goats, or are the ones listed in the books, really the only ones I need to worry about?
I would Google it because there's a lot of books and a lot of various experience writing those books. But even if you Google, I know there's a couple universities that have good lists, so it doesn't hurt. Kind of print them all off and walk around your property and see if they're on any of them. So copy the page of the book and then staple them together and go for a walk. That's what we've done.
Do you have suggested books to look up? Like, do you have favorite ones that you revert back to?
So my favorite one is actually a website, and it's called Fiasco Farm. And it's also like Molly's Herbal. She does a lot of herbal, different goat and human stuff. But they're just, I tell everyone that's a good place to start. It's super down to earth, basic articles. It's, she's very much, this is my opinion, this came from this. And, she's got a good kidding checklist. She's kind of got, know before you buy and
How do you
buck and
spell
weather
that?
care. FIASCO Farm.
Okay.
So if you Google it, it should come up pretty easily. Her website's pretty popular, but yeah, that is my biggest piece of advice to anybody is just kind of go through that and read a couple articles a day and when you have a second. So,
Oh yeah, absolutely.
but yeah, I'm trying to think. There's a lot of good books out there. It's good to go through them, but kind of like anything, there's not a lot of research in goats. So talking to different people and, I still go to like my mentors all over the country, and I'm really fortunate. I get to work with some vets from UC Davis and everything through appraisal. So, pick everybody's brain and just kind of see what's consistent.
Yeah.
And find like your really trusted sources. Be very careful on Facebook though, because anybody can
Everybody
post
has
on.
access to it.
Exactly. And most of us, honestly, that probably should be giving more advice are not on there because it's like, I can't do this today. I can't get told
Yeah.
like I don't know what I'm doing by somebody who's had goats for like 3 minutes. So be very cautious, especially on like the goat vet groups. They've kind of gotten a little out of control some of the time.
Yeah.
So find people you trust in the area that you can be like, hey, I just have a quick question, and find a really good vet. So where are you in Connecticut?
We're down in New London County, so we're
Okay.
like the Ledyard, Gales Ferry area. So I'm
Okay.
trying to think.
Because I'm trying to think like,
Groton, the sub base down there.
yeah, because like the best Fenton's really good. I don't know if they would go out there. Salmon Brook, Tufts.
Mhm.
Those are kind of like my 3 top goat vets. I'm like, definitely, if you can swing it, go there. But again, talk to people in your area. I know, again, not everybody on there is great, but Connecticut Goat Owners Facebook group is good. So it's a trip sometimes, but again, that's a good place to at least kind of get different opinions on vets. But those 3, Tufts, Fenton, and Salmon Brook, are definitely my, people I trust a lot.
Nice.
So
And a totally random question, just because I've had to monitor this on other farms I've worked at. Do you know if there's any issue with feeding them Salacia, like tomato family or peppers and stuff? Because like I've worked on farms where like we wouldn't feed our chickens that because it can build up some of the different toxins in it because they're in the nightshade family.
I haven't heard of it, but I'm sure like, and I say this with everything, it's like everything in moderation.
Okay.
So if they even like some of the poisonous plants, they get into a little bit, watch them, but 9 out of 10 times, like you can get away with not giving charcoal, just make sure they're not floating and, but
Oh,
it's, yeah, some are more sensitive
Okay.
than others.
Animals can be interesting that way. My
Oh, yeah.
family had a black lab border collie, he was about 80 pounds. Great. He wasn't quite a puppy anymore. He
Mhm.
broke into one of my sister's and I's rooms and ate an entire bag of chocolate chips.
Oh,
And
Yep.
my dad and mom freaked out that our dog was about to keel over. My dad called the vet and they're like, is he seizuring? He's like, no. Is he really hyper? Yes. Oh, he's fine. Like, okay, we thought for sure that would kill him dead. Okay.
Oh, I have, yeah, there's always fun stories, and my vet always knows when I call, it's gonna be great, and if somebody else is on call that night, he still shows up, so.
That's
Yeah,
excellent.
animals are fun.
They can be. It's-
So, any other questions before I take this down, maybe? I think we're good. So, and like I said, my email's up there, feel free to, say,
I liked your page and everything.
okay, you're good then. I don't post
I'm
on
on,
it.
I'm like one of those people, like, if it's just like a farm, I like every single farm, no matter what area it is.
You'd always learn something, or like, worst case, there's cute pictures,
Yeah.
so.
So you guys,
I'll throw every picture there is.
I'm going to jump in here and because we should wrap up the session and say thank you to Grace. Thank you for your presentation today.
Thank you guys for
Thank
coming.
you.